Stella Langley stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Flats, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1881 with nothing but a battered leather trunk, a half-empty purse, and the very deliberate intention of never being found again. The town was smaller than she had imagined, which suited her purposes exactly. A single main street of sun-bleached timber buildings stretched perhaps 200 yards from the livery stable at one end to the assay office at the other. A dry goods store, a barber shop, a saloon with a painted sign that had faded to near illegibility, a post office no bigger than a horse stall, and a whitewashed church whose steeple leaned slightly east as though straining to hear whatever was being said in the saloon. Red dust sat on every surface the way snow would settle in the Ohio Valley she had left behind, and the mountains to the west were so enormous and so immediate that Stella had to remind herself to breathe when she saw them for the first time, their faces the color of iron ore and old blood, their summits carrying snow even in late April. She had come from Columbus, Ohio, by train to Santa Fe, and then by stagecoach into this raw corner of the territory, and she had told no one her destination. Not her sister, not the lawyer who had handled what little remained of her estate after the creditors of her late husband had finished with it, not the women of the Methodist congregation who had turned her widowhood into a subject of polite and relentless fascination. Stella was 27 years old, recently widowed, quietly but thoroughly ruined in the financial sense, and she had decided with a clarity that felt almost surgical that the only honest thing left for her to do was to start over somewhere so remote that the past could not locate her on a map. She had read about the territory in a newspaper advertisement placed by a land office in Albuquerque. Homestead land still available under the Homestead Act of 1862. 160 acres. 5 years of continuous residence and a small filing fee, and the land was yours. The advertisement had used words like opportunity and frontier and honest labor, and those words had sounded, to a woman sitting in a boarding house in Columbus with $4.30 to her name, like a direct and personal message. She had corresponded with the land office. She had arranged the filing in advance. By the time she stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Flats, the parcel on file had her name on it. 160 acres of high desert grassland situated 4 miles northeast of town, bounded to the north by a seasonal creek called Morrow Run, and to the west by the edge of a property that, according to the land agent's letter, belonged to a cattle rancher named Wells. The land agent, a thin man named Mr. Corbett with ink stains on both hands and a persistent cough, met her at the stagecoach and drove her out to the parcel in a buckboard that afternoon. The road, such as it was, eventually dissolved into a pair of wheel ruts in the grass, and then the wheel ruts gave up entirely, and there was only the land itself, rolling and enormous and achingly quiet under the enormous sky. Most folks file these claims and never come out to look at them, Mr. Corbett said, which was the closest thing to discouragement he offered. He seemed like a man who had learned not to argue with determined women. Stella stood on what was now legally her land and looked at the ruins of a small adobe structure that had apparently belonged to a previous claimant who had abandoned the filing. The walls stood to about shoulder height on 3 sides. The roof was gone. The interior was full of dried brush and what appeared to be a significant quantity of dead leaves accumulated over several seasons. To the east, the land opened up in a long, gentle slope toward the mountains. To the west she could see, perhaps a quarter mile away, a fence line of cedar posts and wire, and beyond it, cattle grazing in unhurried groups. "The Wells Ranch runs right up to that line?" she asked. "Lewis Wells runs the Box W," Mr. Corbett confirmed. "Been out here about 8 years. Good man. He'll likely come introduce himself once he knows you're here. Everyone knows everyone's business in Redemption Flats." Stella absorbed this information without particular enthusiasm. She had not come to the territory to make friends or neighbors. She had come to disappear into the land, to work it with her own hands, to build something so quietly and so thoroughly her own that the woman she had been in Ohio, the woman who had married the wrong man and trusted the wrong promises and lost everything to a combination of his careless debts and her own stubborn loyalty, would gradually cease to exist. She spent her first night in the ruins of the adobe, wrapped in her traveling blanket, listening to the absolute silence of the desert dark and the occasional distant call of an animal she could not identify. The stars above the broken walls were so numerous and so low they seemed almost physical, as though she could reach up and disturb them. She did not feel afraid. She felt, for the first time in 2 years, entirely and accurately alone, and it was the most peaceful thing she had experienced since before her husband's debts had come due. She was up before dawn, and she worked. Over the following 2 weeks, Stella Langley became a study in stubborn human industry. She had some money, not much, but enough to purchase basic lumber from the mill at Redemption Flats, basic tools from the dry goods store, and a month's worth of dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, and coffee. She hired 2 Mexican laborers from town for 3 days to help her shore up the adobe walls and lay new roof beams, and then she finished the roof herself with boards and a layer of packed mud over brush, which was the traditional method in this part of the territory, and which Mr. Corbett had explained to her with surprising technical detail during their second meeting. She dug out the interior of the structure until the floor was level and tamped. She made a door from 3 boards, and a pair of iron hinges she pried from a discarded gate she found half buried in the brush at the far edge of her property. She set a window frame on the south wall and covered it with oilcloth until she could afford glass. The work was brutal. Her hands blistered, and the blisters burst and hardened into calluses within the first week. The sun at this elevation and latitude had a particular ruthless quality that burned through her bonnet within the first hour of each day. She had brought enough sense with her to keep her arms and neck covered, but by the end of the first week, her face had gone from pale Ohio skin to something considerably darker and more weathered, and she regarded this change in her small hand mirror each morning not with vanity, but with something resembling satisfaction. She was becoming a different person. That was precisely the intention. She had not yet met her neighbor to the west. She had seen him, or someone she presumed to be him, twice from a distance. Once early in the first week, riding the fence line on a dark horse, pausing at the boundary markers as though confirming his memory of the property line. And once in the second week, when she had climbed to the small rise at the northwest corner of her parcel to look at Morrow Run, she had seen a man on foot about 300 yards away, kneeling beside something in the grass near his fence. He had straightened when she appeared on the rise, and they had looked at each other across that distance for a moment, and then both had gone back to what they were doing, which seemed to her exactly the right response from a neighbor in a place where people came to be left alone. It was on a Thursday in the 3rd week of May that Lewis Wells formally introduced himself, and he did it by preventing her from making a catastrophic error. She had decided to attempt to break a portion of the land for a kitchen garden. She had marked out a patch of ground on the south side of the adobe, about 20 feet by 30 feet, which received good morning sun, and she had begun turning the soil with a mattock she had purchased from the dry goods store. The work was hard because the soil here, though it looked loose and red on the surface, had a layer of caliche about 8 inches down, a pale calcium-rich hardpan that turned the mattock's blade like iron. She was attacking this caliche layer with considerable determination, and making almost no progress when she heard a horse stop near her and a man's voice say, with a careful neutrality that suggested he was trying not to sound amused, "That is going to take you a considerable time." She looked up. The man sitting the dark horse was perhaps 32 or 33, lean in the way that outdoor work made a man lean, with a brown face and dark eyes under the brim of a battered hat that had seen considerable weather. He wore a collarless work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled at least once. He was looking at what she was doing with the expression of a man watching someone perform a task that could be improved. "It already has," Stella said, and did not stop working. "Lewis Wells," he said. "I run the box W." He indicated the direction of his property with a slight turn of his head. "Stella Langley," she said. "I am aware of who you are, Mr. Wells. That caliche layer runs about the depth of your forearm across most of this quarter section," he said. "You can break through it with a pickaxe, which will take about 3 times as long as what you are currently attempting. Or you can soak it with water for 2 days first, which will loosen it considerably. Morrow Run has enough water in it right now that you could divert a small channel." She stopped working and looked at him properly. He was not offering this advice as a criticism. His voice was entirely even, the tone of a man who had spent years learning the land and was passing along information the way you would pass the salt. "How much water is in Morrow Run right now?" she asked. "Enough for your purposes," he said. "The snowmelt keeps it running through June most years. By August it will be dry." She looked at the caliche layer and then back at him. "You are saying I have been wasting my morning. I am saying there is an easier way." A silence passed between them that was not uncomfortable. A hawk turned slow circles over the eastern end of her property. The mountains to the west of his fence were going gold in the afternoon light. "I would appreciate knowing where I should cut that channel," she said, which was as close as she generally came to asking for help. He dismounted, and they walked the north edge of her property together to examine Morrow Run, which was indeed running with a promising volume of cold, clear water from the snowmelt above. He showed her the natural grade of the land, which sloped conveniently toward her garden plot, and indicated where a shallow channel dug about 50 feet through the grass would carry enough water to soak the caliche and make the digging workable. He showed her how to dam the channel mouth temporarily with sod so the water could be directed, and then stopped. He did all of this in the same even, practical voice, pointing things out the way, a man would who simply knew the land and found it natural to share that knowledge. He did not ask her why she had come here alone. He did not ask about a husband or family. He did not express surprise or concern that she was proposing to homestead 160 acres by herself. These were all the things that men and women both in Redemption Flats had been unable to resist asking when she had been in town, and his restraint in this regard struck her as remarkable. "Thank you," she said, when they were back near the adobe. "That is genuinely useful." "The land will work with you if you learn it first," he said, and the simplicity of the statement made it sound less like advice and more like a philosophy. He collected his horse and rode back west toward his fence line without ceremony, and Stella stood watching him go with an expression she would not have been able to name and did not try to. She diverted the channel the following morning. It worked exactly as he had said it would. 2 days later, the caliche was soft enough to break with the mattock, and by the end of that week she had a kitchen garden plot fully turned and ready for seed, which she planted in careful rows. Beans, squash, corn after the fashion she had been advised would grow in this climate, onions, a small section of turnips, and in one optimistic corner, a row of marigolds, because she had been given a handful of seeds by a woman in the dry goods store named Mrs. Almendarez, who had pressed them into her hand with the firmness of someone issuing instructions and said, "They keep the rabbits off. Mostly." Lewis Wells came back of his own accord 8 days after the first meeting, on a Sunday morning when the sky was the particular deep blue that only seemed to exist in the territory, and he had a length of cedar rail in the back of his wagon. "I am repairing my north fence," he said. "There is some material left over. I thought you might use it for a corral frame if you are planning to keep an animal." She was planning to keep an animal. She had been corresponding with a man in Socorro about a mule, and the mule was supposed to arrive within the fortnight. She had not told anyone this. She was unreasonably pleased that he had anticipated it. "How much do you want for it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "It is leftover material." "I do not accept charity," she said, not unkindly but clearly. He considered this with the same steadiness that seemed to characterize all of his responses. "Then give me a day's help with the fence repair when you have time," he said. "My ranch hand broke 2 fingers last week. I am short a pair of hands." This seemed to her a fair exchange. "Agreed," she said. He unloaded the cedar rail, and she helped him carry it to the south side of the adobe, where she had already decided a small enclosure would go. He spent perhaps an hour helping her frame out the posts, and then he left, promising to return with the remainder of the cedar he had set aside. He did not stay for coffee, did not linger, did not look at her the way men in Redemption Flats sometimes looked at her when she came into town, with that particular combination of speculation and pity that she found equally galling. He was simply present and useful, and then he left. She found herself thinking about this later in a way that was not entirely about practicality. Over the course of that spring and early summer, an understanding developed between Stella Langley and Lewis Wells that was built entirely out of practical exchanges and had the effect of something considerably warmer. She worked the day on his fence line as agreed, and it was hard work, driving posts and stretching wire in the heat, and she did it without complaint and with enough competence that he said, at the end of the day while they were washing their hands at the pump near his barn, "You have done this kind of work before." It was not a question, but she answered it. "No," she said, drying her hands on her skirt, "but I am a quick student." The corners of his eyes creased slightly, which she had come to understand was what passed for a smile with Lewis Wells in the first stages of acquaintance. "That is evident," he said. She had dinner that evening at his ranch house, which was a proper adobe structure of 4 rooms, considerably more substantial than her own dwelling, with a covered porch along the south side and a kitchen garden of its own, already mature and productive. Tended, she would later learn, by his housekeeper, a Navajo woman named Dolly who had worked for him for 4 years, and who regarded Stella with a measuring look that communicated neither welcome nor hostility but simply assessment, which Stella found she respected. Dolly cooked a meal of beef stewed with dried chilies and onions, and served it with corn tortillas and a pot of strong coffee, and Lewis Wells and Stella Langley ate it at a table by the window with the evening light going copper and long across the desert outside, and they talked. Not about their pasts, not about their wounds. They talked about the land, about the summer rains that would come in July if the season was normal, about the grassland management that allowed him to run 200 head on this range without overgrazing it, about the volcanic rock formations on the eastern edge of his property that he had never fully explored, about the particular quality of the light in October when the cottonwoods along the creek went gold. He talked about these things with a careful, genuine love that was the most honest form of affection she had yet encountered in him, and she found herself leaning forward slightly, listening with more attention than she generally gave to conversation. When she rode back to her own property that evening on the mule that had arrived the week prior, a solid, temperamental animal she had named Chet after no one in particular, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt curious, not about the land, though she was that too, but about Lewis Wells, the particular shape of his history, the way he had come to love this specific quarter of the earth so thoroughly that it was visible in every practical thing he did. She did not act on this curiosity. She worked, she planted. She repaired the adobe further, managing to acquire 2 actual glass panes for the window from a freight shipment that came through Redemption Flats in early June, and she installed them herself with a mixture of pride and considerable swearing under her breath. She expanded the kitchen garden when the rains began in July, and the water table shifted and the ground became more workable. She acquired a small flock of chickens from a woman on the edge of town who was reducing her flock before moving to Albuquerque, and the chickens turned out to be far more entertaining company than she had anticipated, strutting around the yard in small, indignant groups and producing eggs with a reliability that delighted her. She came to town once a week for supplies and post, and she gradually became a recognized, if somewhat reserved, member of the community. Mrs. Almendarez at the dry goods store was her most consistent social contact in town, a generous and inexhaustibly informed woman of about 50 who knew everything about everyone in Redemption Flats and shared it with the democratic cheerfulness of someone who considered information to be a communal resource. Through Mrs. Almendarez, Stella learned things about Lewis Wells that he would never have told her himself. He had come from Texas originally. He had built the Box W from raw land, the same way Stella was doing, though 8 years earlier when the territory had been considerably rougher and the Apache troubles were not entirely settled. He had been married once briefly to a woman who had lasted 2 years in the territory before deciding that she preferred the civilization of San Antonio, and they had parted with apparent civility and no children. He was, in the opinion of Redemption Flats generally, a good man, a fair man, a man who paid his debts and kept his word and minded his business in a community where the third quality was particularly prized. He was liked but not in the way of self-sufficient men, particularly intimate with anyone. He came to your fence line twice last month, Mrs. Almendarez mentioned one morning in late July, with a precision that made clear she was not reporting gossip but delivering intelligence. That is more than he came to the Whitfield place in 5 years, and the Whitfields were his nearest neighbors before you. He had leftover lumber, Stella said, examining a bolt of cotton print with perhaps more attention than it required. Mrs. Almendarez looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who has decided not to argue with a fact she finds unconvincing. It was in late August that the first real thing happened between them, the first thing that broke out of the practical register they had been conducting their acquaintance in, and it happened because of a storm. The summer thunderstorms in the territory were events of a theatrical scale that Ohio had not prepared Stella for. She knew weather. Ohio in November was cold enough to be serious, and the spring storms off the lake could be rough. But the afternoon thunderstorms that developed over the mountains in August in New Mexico territory were a different category of natural phenomenon entirely. They came up in 2 hours from clear blue sky, boiling upward in massive white towers that went dark from the inside out, and when they arrived with a ferocity of lightning and rain and hail and wind that was entirely committed. The storm that caught her in the open on the 23rd of August was a particularly determined one. She had been working on the east end of her property. About half a mile from the adobe, clearing brush from a section, she was thinking about breaking for a proper field in the fall, and the storm came up over the mountains faster than any she had yet seen, going from white towers to black ceiling in less than an hour. She was on Chet and heading back toward the adobe when the lightning started coming close, 3 strikes in rapid succession to the east that turned the air electric and smelled like copper and burning grass. Chet, who was generally phlegmatic to a fault, took profound exception to a strike that came down perhaps 80 yards to the north, and he unloaded Stella into a clump of grama grass with a decisive efficiency that suggested this was something he had been considering for some time. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath out of her, and Chet was gone, galloping west toward the fence line with his reins flying. And then the hail came, the size of small marbles, and the rain behind it came so hard it was difficult to see. She was up and running for the only shelter available, which was the volcanic rock formation on the eastern edge of the Box W property, a cluster of weathered basalt columns that she knew from her exploration of the area offered some overhang, when she heard a horse and Lewis Wells appeared out of the rain like a figure in a dream, low in the saddle, hat brim streaming water, riding directly toward her through the hail with an expression of focused urgency. He had seen the mule running loose on his property. He had come for her. He pulled his horse up beside her and reached down a hand, and she took it, and in one clean motion that took her completely off her feet and set her on the horse behind him, He got her to the rock formation in about 2 minutes of hard riding that she spent with her arms around his waist and her face against his shoulder. And when they reached the overhang and the horse stopped and the roar of the rain was around them but not on them, she was shaking slightly, though not from cold. He turned to look at her in the dimness under the rock. Water was running from his hat brim. The hail was still coming down in the open beyond the overhang, ringing on the basalt with a sound like scattered shot. "Are you hurt?" he said. There was something in his voice that was not the practical, even tone she had come to expect, something that had its edges in it. "No," she said. "My dignity, perhaps." His hands were on her upper arms, checking her, and she realized she was still shaking and that he had noticed it. He did not remove his hands. "Chet threw you," he said. "Chet apparently has principles I was not previously aware of," she said, and the trembling in her voice was not entirely from the fall. The closeness was something she had not accounted for. He smelled like leather and cedar and rain, and his hands on her arms were warm through her wet sleeve. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that always seemed to be reading something slightly deeper than the surface of what was happening, and then he let his hands fall. They stood side by side under the overhang and watched the storm continue its tremendous performance over the desert, the lightning illuminating the mountains in staccato flashes, the rain coming in curtains across the grassland, and Stella thought with a sudden and disconcerting clarity that she was not actually trying to disappear anymore. She had been trying to disappear, and somewhere in the last 3 months she had stopped, and she was not certain when it had happened, but she suspected it had something to do with the man standing beside her. Neither of them said anything about this. The storm lasted another 20 minutes and then moved east, quick as it had come, leaving the desert smelling of wet sage and creosote and the particular clean scent of rain on hot rock. They found Chet standing on Lewis's property near the fence with his reins caught on a cedar post, entirely self-satisfied. Lewis retrieved the mule with an equanimity that the mule did not reciprocate. He rode with her back to the adobe and he looked at her roof. The adobe had held perfectly, as he had known it would. He built her a small fire in the hearth inside while she changed into dry clothes in the back partition, and when she came out, he was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking at the row of herbs she had hung to dry from the ceiling beam, and he said, without turning around, "You have made something real here." The simplicity of the statement and the weight it had did something to her chest that she had not been prepared for. "I am trying," she said. He turned then, and the firelight was behind him, and he looked at her with an expression that was no longer the careful neutrality of a neighbor being useful, and she looked back at him with the same absence of pretense, because she had never been a woman who found pretense comfortable. And for a moment, they simply occupied the same small space of her adobe kitchen, with all of that honesty between them like something almost visible. Then he put his hat on and said he would check on the north fence line before dark, and he left, and Stella stood at her window and watched him ride away through the washed clean evening, the mountains going pink and gold behind his property, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and thought that the land had not done what she had asked it to do. She had come here to disappear, and the land had done something else with her entirely. The fall came on in September with a shift in the quality of the light, and a sharpness in the morning air that was exhilarating after the heat of summer. The kitchen garden had yielded abundantly enough that Stella had spent the better part of 2 weeks putting up vegetables in the clay jars she had bought from a potter in Redemption Flats, and her cellar, such as it was, a dug space beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, was well stocked. She had broken the east field, with assistance from Chet and a borrowed plow from Lewis, and it was ready for a spring wheat planting if she could afford the seed. She had sold eggs in town and made enough to buy additional lumber, and she had added a proper lean-to on the north side of the adobe that served as a covered workspace and storage area. The chickens lived in a sturdy little coop that she had built herself and was rather proud of. She had also, gradually and without any formal announcement, begun spending more time at the box W it had started practically. Lewis had asked her if she was interested in learning to handle cattle, because he was short-handed going into fall roundup and would pay day wages, and she had said yes because she needed the money, and because she was fundamentally unable to decline any proposition that involved learning a new skill. She had spent 5 days working the fall gather with Lewis and his 2 remaining hands, a quiet older Mexican man named Tomas who had worked for Lewis for 6 years, and a younger man of about 19 named Pete who was from somewhere in Kansas and treated every day as though it might contain an adventure. Cattle work was something Stella found she had a genuine aptitude for, which surprised no one more than herself. She could read the movement of a herd in a way that felt almost instinctive, the way the animals telegraphed their intentions through small shifts in posture and direction. By the 3rd day, Tomas, who spoke to her barely more than he spoke to anyone else, which was not much, nodded at her in a way that conveyed something she recognized as professional respect. In the evenings of those 5 days, she ate supper at the ranch with Lewis and Tomas and Pete, and the easy rhythm of those meals, the plain food, the practical conversation about the next day's work, the way Lewis presided over his table with a quiet authority that was entirely without arrogance, felt like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. On the last evening of the roundup, after Tomas and Pete had gone to their bunkhouse quarters, Lewis and Stella sat on the covered porch and watched the night come on over the desert. There was a crescent moon, and the stars were doing what they always did in this country, which was everything. The coyotes were having a conversation somewhere in the middle distance. "You are good with the cattle," he said. "Better than most men I have hired." "That seems unlikely," she said. "It is not a compliment for its own sake," he said. "I do not offer those." She knew this was true. In 6 months of knowing Lewis Wells, she had never once heard him say anything he did not mean. It was one of the qualities that made his company different from most, the quality that made it possible to hear what he said and believe it entirely. "Why did you really come here?" he asked, and it was the first time he had asked anything personal, and the fact that he asked it now, on this quiet porch in this particular light, meant that he was ready to hear the full answer and that he was asking because it mattered to him to know. She considered being evasive. She had been carrying the story of her marriage, and the collapse that followed like something in a closed room. She had decided she would not open for anyone in this new life. But the territory had been changing her, slowly and without her permission, and it appeared that Lewis Wells was part of that change. She told him. She told him about her husband, a charming and convincing man named Harold Langley, who she had married at 23 with honest expectations, and who had turned out to be a man of substantial charisma and genuinely terrible judgment when it came to money. He had borrowed against their house and her small inheritance and 2 businesses he had started with other people's capital, and when the debts came due, he had gone east on a supposed business trip and simply not returned. He had died 8 months later of a fever in Pittsburgh, and the creditors had arrived at Stella's door within the week. She had spent the following year paying what she could and losing what she could not save, and had emerged from it with nothing except a thorough and lasting education in her own capability to survive. "I was not running from grief," she said clearly. "I want to say that plainly. I had grieved what I thought the marriage was long before Harold died. I was running from the particular humiliation of being the woman that everyone looked at with that specific pity, the kind that has a little bit of told you so underneath it." Lewis was quiet for a moment. "There is nothing in that story that reflects badly on you," he said. "I know that," she said. "I know it here." She touched her head, but knowing it here, she touched her chest. "Took some time." "It took leaving," he said. "Yes," she said. "It took leaving and coming here and having the land simply not care what my story was." He nodded slowly. "The land does not care," he said. "That is one of the true things about it." The coyotes had moved further off. The crescent moon was very bright. She could see the outline of the mountains against the sky, massive and certain. "What is your story?" she said. He told her. It was shorter than hers in some ways and longer in others. He had grown up in West Texas, one of 4 sons of a rancher who had failed twice and succeeded once, and the success had come too late to benefit any of the sons, because the old man had spent it on 2 excellent horses and a great deal of whiskey. Lewis had worked his way north and west doing everything a man could do in that country. Cattle drives, freighting, a year of scouting for the army that he mentioned once and did not elaborate on, and he had filed his homestead claim in 1873 when he was 23 years old with $65 and 2 horses. He had built everything on the Box W himself, acquiring cattle slowly, improving the range, hiring hands only when the work absolutely required it. The marriage he spoke of briefly and without bitterness. She had been a woman who deserved a different life, he said, and she had gone and found one, and he hoped she had. "Were you lonely?" Stella asked, meaning the years after. He looked at her sideways. The honesty she had come to expect from him was there, considering the question. "Yes," he said. "I am not a man who needs a great deal of company, but there is a difference between solitude and loneliness, and I was not always able to stay on the right side of that line." She understood this distinction in her bones. They sat for a while longer without speaking, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled, and Stella became gradually aware that she had not felt this particular quality of ease with another person in so long that she had almost forgotten it was possible. When she stood to go, he walked with her to where Chet was tied. She mounted, and he stood with his hand on the horse's neck in the casual way of a man who is comfortable with animals, and he looked up at her in the moonlight, and she looked down at him. And the thing that had been accumulating between them since the day he had stopped his horse on the edge of her property and told her she was attacking Kalichi the wrong way was so clearly present in that moment that it would have taken deliberate effort on both their parts to ignore it. "Good night, Stella," he said, and the use of her first name, which was new, sounded different than anything he had said before, more careful, more considered. "Good night, Lewis," she said. She rode home through the moonlit desert and arrived at her adobe and put Chet in his corral and stood in her kitchen with the lamp lit and pressed both her hands flat on the work table and told herself very seriously that she had come here to disappear and to become herself, and that she was not going to complicate that recovery with another attachment that could leave her diminished. This resolution lasted about 4 days. On the 4th day, Lewis came over to help her winterize the lean-to, adding a second layer of boards against the coming cold that the territory could bring down with considerable severity from December through February, and they worked side by side for most of the morning, and at some point in the afternoon she handed him a nail and their hands touched, and he did not move his hand away, and she did not either. And they stood there in the slanted fall light with their hands touching over a nail, and the entire accumulated weight of months of proximity and honesty and practical regard, and the moment in the storm and the evening on the porch came to rest in that small contact. He said very quietly, "I would like to say something." "Yes," she said. "I have not wanted to say anything too soon," he said, looking at their hands and then at her face, "because I thought you needed time and the land and your own building of something to come first, and I still think that is true, but I would be dishonest if I did not say that I have thought about very little else for some months." The precise honesty of this, its careful and respectful construction, was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, which perhaps said something about her previous marriage and perhaps said something about Lewis Wells specifically. She suspected it was more the latter. "I have also thought about very little else," she said, which was true, and she had learned from him the value of saying true things plainly. He raised her hand that still held the nail and held it in both of his, which was a gesture so simple and so full of intention that she felt the back of her eyes go warm. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the desert beyond the lean-to, going gold and then amber, the shadow of the mountains moving slowly east. "Then I would like to court you properly," he said. If you are willing, with no pressure about anything beyond that, at whatever pace you need." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am willing," she said. And that was how it began. Properly, as he had said, which in practice meant that he came to her property on Sunday afternoons, and they sat on the rough bench she had made and placed outside her south-facing wall in the good sun, and they talked. They talked for hours, the way people talk when they have discovered that the other person's mind is genuinely interesting, ranging widely across everything from the management of grassland to the philosophy of what it meant to build something honest from the ground up to the books she had brought with her, and the newspapers that came in the mail with a 3-week delay from the East. The broad world and its events and opinions discussed in the particular remove of the New Mexico territory, where everything happening elsewhere felt like news from another universe. He brought her things that were practical rather than romantic. A proper handsaw he had acquired from a hardware supplier in Albuquerque because he had noticed hers was dull. A jar of the dried chilies that Dolly processed from the Box W garden, and which Stella had admired at supper. A mare that had foaled in the spring, and was not suited to cattle work, but was gentle and well-mannered, and would be more comfortable for riding than Chet, who he delivered with a straightforwardness that made clear he was not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was, which was both a useful gift and an expression of care. She named the mare Juniper. He also came when he was not expected, sometimes just to ride the boundary of his property when it happened to bring him near hers, and he would raise a hand and she would raise hers, and this small acknowledgment across the distance became something she looked forward to with a fervor that she found slightly embarrassing when she examined it clearly. November brought frost, and then a real cold that put ice on Morrow Run, and required Stella to add 2 heavy wool blankets to her sleeping arrangement and keep the hearth going through the night. She had laid in enough wood from a stand of dead juniper she had found at the northeast corner of her property, cutting and hauling it with Chet and Juniper over the course of 3 weeks, and she had enough to last through February if the winter was not unusually long. Lewis came in late November on a Saturday with Tomas to help her reinforce the chicken coop against the cold, adding a hay bale lining inside and packing the ground with straw, and afterward Stella made coffee and served it with corn bread she had made that morning. And Tomas, who was the most economical man with words she had ever met, said, "This is good," about the corn bread, and from him this was clearly the equivalent of a standing ovation. It was after Tomas had gone back to the ranch that Lewis kissed her for the first time. They were standing in her kitchen in the late afternoon, with the cold light coming through the glass windows and the fire going in the hearth and the smell of coffee and the corn bread still in the air, and she had turned from the table to find him closer than she had expected, which was not an accident, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he said, with that characteristic care, "May I?" "Yes," she said, for the second time in response to a question from this man that changed something between them. He kissed her very gently once, with both his hands cupping her face as though she were something he was afraid of dropping, and she closed her eyes and thought that the territory had been right, that the land had been right, that whatever had brought her here to the specific intersection of this desert, and this man had known something she had not known when she had stepped off that stagecoach in the spring. When they separated, he did not move away. He kept her face in his hands and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I want you to know that nothing about what I want from you has anything to do with pity or rescue." This was so precisely the right thing to say, so perfectly calibrated to the specific injury she had carried, that she understood completely and immediately that he had been paying attention to her for months, had understood her in a way that mattered. "I know," she said. "I know that." The winter in Redemption Flats was cold and quiet and long, and Stella lived it in a state of slow contentment that was so different from the anxious vigilance of the previous 2 years in Ohio that she sometimes had to stop in the middle of a task and simply acknowledge it, the clean and present fact of being all right, of being in a place and a life that she had built herself, on her own terms, without permission or condition. She and Louis saw each other 2 or 3 times a week through the winter. Sometimes he rode over in the morning, and they went out together to check the fences on the boundary of both their properties, the work making a practical container for their company that suited them both. Sometimes she rode Juniper to the Box W in the afternoon and had supper with Dolly and Louis and whoever else was about the ranch, and Dolly had gradually extended to her a kind of approval that expressed itself in small acts of teaching, showing Stella how to make the stewed chili dishes that were the staple of the ranch kitchen, explaining the particular properties of the various dried plants she kept in her stores for illness and injury, treating Stella with the directness of someone who has decided to take a person seriously. In December, 2 things happened that changed the texture of the winter. The first was that a man named Crandall arrived in Redemption Flats representing a railroad speculator based in Denver who had designs on acquiring land in the area for a possible rail line, and he began making the rounds of the property owners with cash offers and considerable pressure. He came to Stella's adobe on a Tuesday morning without prior announcement and presented himself at her door with a very clean hat and a contract already prepared. The offer was for $240 for her 160 acres, which was more money than she had in total at that moment. The contract indicated she would need to vacate within 30 days of signing. She read the contract. She was not a woman who signed things without reading them, a lesson learned at significant personal cost in the matter of her late husband's various arrangements. She read it twice. "No," she said, and gave it back. Crandall looked at her with the expression of a man who believed that the word no from a woman in this context indicated a desire to negotiate rather than a final position. "I could speak with Mr. Wells about this together," he said, implying that Louis would make the more sensible decision. "You are welcome to speak with Mr. Wells about whatever concerns Mr. Wells's property," Stella said. "This is my land. The answer is no. I would like you to leave now." He left. She discovered later that Louis had also refused his offer, using language that Tomas, who had been present, reported to her with some admiration, consisting largely of a description of what Crandall and his contract could do with themselves that Stella was fairly certain she could have produced herself under the circumstances. The second thing that happened in December was that Louis asked her if she would consider marrying him. He asked her on an evening when she had come to the ranch for supper, and they had been sitting again on the covered porch despite the cold, wrapped in their coats, because neither of them could seem to have the most important conversations anywhere except that particular porch with that particular view of the desert, and the asking was so characteristically Louis, so honest and so direct and so careful, that she wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously, which she had not done in combination since childhood. "I want to say this properly," he said, turning toward her with his whole attention. "I have been thinking about this for some time. Not because I think you need anything from me, because you have made it entirely clear that you do not, and that is one of the things I love about you, but because I would like to build a life alongside you, not in charge of you and not taking care of you, but alongside you as a partner the way the land works together." She looked at him. The desert was silver and black under a full winter moon. The cold was real and clear. "I love you," she said, because she had been carrying this fact for some time, and it seemed the right moment to set it down. "I came here to disappear, and you are the reason I stopped wanting to." His face in the moonlight did something complicated and beautiful, and he reached over and took her hand in both of his, the same way he had when she had held that nail in October and everything had shifted. "Then is that a yes?" he asked. "That is an absolutely unambiguous yes," she said. He kissed her in the cold night air on the porch with the mountains dark behind them and the stars doing their extravagant work overhead. And it was a different kiss from the first one in the kitchen, longer and warmer, and carrying everything that had accumulated since April when she had stepped off a stagecoach with a battered trunk and the intention of vanishing, and the territory had simply declined to let her. They were married in February of 1882 in the whitewashed church with the slightly eastward-leaning steeple, on a morning when there was thin snow on the ground, and the mountains were spectacular and white, and the sky above them was the blue that only existed in this country. The ceremony was performed by the pastor, a methodical man named Reverend Hoyt, and witnessed by Mrs. Almendarez and her husband, by Tomas, by Pete, who had decided to stay on at the Box W for another year, by Dolly, who attended in a red wool blanket and regarded the proceedings with a dignified composure that somehow conveyed approval, and by Mr. Corbett, the land agent who had driven Stella out to her parcel on her first day, and who cried with a frankness that surprised everyone, including himself. Stella wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had mended at the collar and pressed carefully the night before, and she carried a small bunch of dried juniper berries tied with a piece of blue ribbon, because there were no flowers in February, and she thought it was the most honest wedding she had ever witnessed, the absence of any pretense about it being the quality that made it beautiful. Louis stood at the front of the church in his good shirt with his hat in his hands and watched her walk toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, the careful steadiness of it, but underneath that steadiness something so open and so genuine that it made the whole leaning church glow. "I do," she said when it was required, and meant it with everything she was. They did not go on a honeymoon, which would have been an impractical and even amusing idea given the circumstances. But Louis had spent 3 days the previous week making the Box W's main bedroom as comfortable as he could, adding new curtains to the window and a proper rug on the floor, and a second oil lamp on the table, small gestures that she found more moving than any larger display would have been, because they were so thoroughly in his idiom practical affection. She moved into the ranch house and kept her adobe. This was her decision, made unilaterally and then explained to Louis with enough clarity that he simply said, "Of course," as though there had never been any question, which was correct. "The homestead claim requires 5 years of residence," she said, "and I am not quitting this land." "I would not want you to," he said. The adobe became her workspace, the place she went in the mornings to do her own work. She was writing letters to a seed company in Kansas City about a proper grain operation on her east field, corresponding with the university agricultural extension that had recently been established in the territory about soil improvement methods, and spending time on a project that had begun as her own record-keeping and was evolving into something larger. A detailed account of methods for small-scale high-desert farming that she thought might be of use to other women filing homestead claims on their own, of whom there were more than most people realized, scattered across the territory in various degrees of isolation and various degrees of success. The spring of 1882 was extraordinary. The winter rains had been good, and the grass on both properties was green and thick, in a way that made Louis stand on his porch in the early mornings and look satisfied in the quiet and absolute way of a man whose life has arranged itself into something that matches what he hoped for. He had added to his herd over the winter, acquiring 40 head from a rancher in Arizona who was selling out, and the Box W was running close to 260 cattle now, which was about the maximum the range could sustain without degrading the grass. Stella's east field went in with wheat and barley in March, and came up strong in April, the grain making a green ripple across the lower field that she could see from the adobe doorway in the morning and felt unreasonably proud of. She kept the kitchen garden expanded and productive and began a small orchard on the east side of the ranch house, planting 6 apple trees and 4 apricot trees purchased from a nursery in Albuquerque, fruit trees being a long-term investment in the future of a place, in a way she found deeply satisfying. She also wrote to her sister in Columbus. She had not done so since leaving, and the silence had been an unkindness she acknowledged honestly in the letter. She told her sister where she was. She told her about the land and the work and Louis. She told her nothing about what she had wanted to escape and everything about what she had found. Her sister's response arrived 6 weeks later and was warm and full of the specific relief of someone who had been worried for a long time and was enormously grateful to have that worry resolved. In June, Stella realized she was pregnant. She was not surprised exactly, and she was not afraid, but she sat with the knowledge for several days before she told Lewis, not because she was uncertain of his response, but because she wanted to sit with it herself first, to know what she felt about it on her own terms before she shared it. What she felt was joy, which was large and simple and did not require much analysis. She told him on a Sunday evening on their porch, sitting as they always did in the good evening light with the desert going golden below the mountains, and he turned to look at her with a stillness that preceded any visible reaction, and then his face did that complicated and beautiful thing again, and he reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest and held it there. "Are you well?" he said, because this was Lewis, for whom the first question was always the practical and caring one. "Very well," she said, "better than well." He raised her hand and kissed it, which he did with a simplicity that was so full of feeling it made her throat close. "I am going to say something that I want you to take in the spirit it is offered," she said. "Say it," he said. "I am going to keep the homestead claim active. I am going to keep working the adobe and the east field. The baby will not change that." "I know," he said. "You know," she said. "I knew when I married you," he said. "I have never once thought that would change." He looked at her steadily. "Your land and your work are part of who you are. I would not want to take them from you any more than you would want them taken." She pressed her lips together. "You are an exceptional man, Lewis Wells," she said. "I have an exceptional wife," he said. The summer of 1882 was the best and the hardest and the most vivid summer of Stella Langley's life, which she now lived under the name Stella Wells, though she still sometimes signed her homestead correspondence as Stella Langley, because the claim was in that name, and also because some part of her would always be that woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in the red dust with a battered trunk and the intention of vanishing, and she did not want to lose her entirely. The heat was exceptional that year, and the pregnancy was not comfortable in the heat, but she managed, working in the mornings and resting in the afternoons on Dolly's firm advisory, Dolly having very decided opinions about the management of pregnancy that were based on knowledge of the land and the body that Stella had come to respect absolutely. Dolly's remedies for the nausea of the early months worked better than anything Stella had previously encountered, and she said so plainly, and Dolly gave her a look of the kind that says, "I know this, but it is good that you acknowledge it." The wheat harvest came in August, and Stella managed it on horseback with Lewis and Tomas and Pete, directing the cutting from junipers back in the last month of her pregnancy, and being told regularly by various parties that she should go inside and consistently ignoring this advice, a pattern of behavior that Lewis observed with an affection that had entirely given up trying to express itself as concern. Their son was born on the 4th of September 1882, delivered by the doctor from Redemption Flats who arrived in time, and by Dolly, who would have managed perfectly well without him, and did in fact do most of the work. Lewis sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state of controlled anxiety that expressed itself as complete stillness, which was how Lewis Wells dealt with things he could not fix by doing something. When Dolly opened the door and said, in her economical way, "Come in," he went in, and Stella was sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she looked up at him with a face that was exhausted and radiant in equal proportion, and she said, "Come and meet him." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, looking down at the small face with an expression that was completely unguarded, all his characteristic steadiness temporarily suspended in favor of something vast and new. "Samuel," she said, "if you agree." He looked up at her. "Samuel," he said, as though he was learning the word. "Yes." They named him Samuel Lewis Wells, and he was a loud and determined infant who from the first days of his life demonstrated a set of opinions about his circumstances, and a willingness to express them that his father found somewhat startling, and his mother found entirely recognizable. The years that followed in Redemption Flats were the years that turned the territory into a real country. The railroad came through in 1883, not on the line that Crandall had proposed, which would have run through both their properties, but on a different alignment 5 miles south that served the town without displacing anyone who had refused to be displaced. This brought more settlers, more commerce, more change to Redemption Flats, which grew from a frontier outpost into a proper small town with a school and a telegraph office and a second doctor and a bank. Stella's homestead claim matured in the spring of 1886, the full 5 years of continuous residence completed, and she stood at the land office with Lewis beside her, and received the deed for 160 acres in her own name, and felt the solid, legal permanence of it as one of the most significant things she had accomplished, equal in its way to the birth of her children, because it was the achievement of the original intention, the thing she had come here to do. The ground that had formed her into whoever she had become. Lewis squeezed her hand outside the land office and said, "It is yours." "It always was," she said. The children. Samuel, born in September of 1882, was a serious and capable boy who showed his father's affinity for the land from the time he could walk, and followed Tomas around the ranch, making observations that Tomas received with his characteristic sparse commentary. In 1884, Stella gave birth to their second child, a daughter named Clara, who arrived in July, and was from her first hours a creature of powerful and cheerful will, who appeared to find everything about her existence amusing. Samuel and Clara were constants in the adobe and the ranch house and the east field and the cattle range, growing up in the total way of children raised on working land, competent and curious and deeply rooted. In 1886, a letter arrived from a publisher in St. Louis. Stella had, over the preceding 3 years, completed and sent out her manuscript about methods for small-scale high-desert homesteading, the project that had begun as her own record-keeping and had grown into a thorough and practical guide. The publisher wanted to print it. They offered her $40 for the rights, and she negotiated them to $60, because she had learned to negotiate, and the book was published in 1887 under the name Stella Wells, and was adopted by the Territorial Agricultural Extension as a recommended text, and copies of it went out to women across New Mexico and Arizona Territory and parts of Texas, women who were doing what she had done or trying to. And she received letters from some of them over the years that she kept in a box under the window seat in the adobe, and read again sometimes, when she needed to be reminded of what work was for. Lewis read the book from cover to cover and said it was excellent and that he had learned 2 things from it he had not known, and from him, this was a review of the highest possible order. Tomas retired from the Box W in 1887, his hands giving him trouble from the years of work, and Lewis gave him a parcel at the south end of the Box W property, where he built a small house and kept a garden and lived with a contentment he expressed almost entirely through the quality of his silence. Pete had married a woman from Redemption Flats in 1884 and started his own small cattle operation south of town. Dolly continued at the Box W, her role expanding over the years to something that was impossible to categorize simply, and that everyone was wise enough not to try. Mrs. Almendarez died in 1888, peacefully and in her own bed, having spent her last months informing everyone in Redemption Flats of everything she knew about them, which was comprehensive. Her husband Francisco kept the dry goods store going with the help of their eldest son, and the store continued to be what it had always been, which was the actual center of civic life in the town. Lewis and Stella had their 3rd child, another son, born in the spring of 1889, and named Robert after Lewis's father in a moment of generosity, toward the old man's memory that Stella thought spoke well of Lewis's capacity for forgiveness. Robert was a combination of both of them in a way that startled people sometimes, with Stella's directness and Lewis's stillness, and he arrived into a household that had grown full and warm and complicated and entirely itself. In the autumn of 1889, New Mexico Territory was working toward statehood, which would come eventually though not yet, and the political activity of the surrounding region was considerable. Stella became involved with a group of women in Redemption Flats who were pressing for women's suffrage at the territorial level, a cause she pursued with the same stubborn directness she brought to everything, writing letters to the territorial legislature and organizing meetings in the church hall with the leaning steeple that had by this time been properly repaired and no longer leaned at all, a fact she regretted slightly because she had been fond of the lean. Lewis supported this work without reservation, which she had expected of him and been right to expect, but the degree to which he took it seriously, reading the legislative documents and discussing the arguments with her in the evenings on their porch, was still something that made her feel the specific warmth of being genuinely known. "You should have the vote," he said simply, one evening in October, looking out at the mountains. "This country would not have been built without the women in it." "It is simply correct. There are a great many men who would disagree with you," she said. "There are a great many men who are wrong," he said. The suffrage campaign did not succeed immediately in the territory, as these things rarely did, but the foundation was laid, and Stella was a part of that foundation. In the spring of 1890, something happened that brought the past briefly and vividly back into the present of Stella's life. Her sister Catherine arrived in Redemption Flats on the stagecoach, having traveled from Columbus with one trunk and the air of a woman who has made a decision and fully intends to stand by it. She was 31, unmarried, and had spent 10 years working as a teacher in Columbus. She stood in the yard of the Box W Ranch house and looked at the mountains and the grassland and the enormous sky and said, very quietly, "I understand now why you didn't come back." She stayed for 3 months. During those 3 months, she fell into the life of the ranch and the homestead with a naturalness that surprised no one who knew the Langley sisters, working alongside Stella in the garden and the east field, riding Juniper with Samuel, who had appointed himself her riding instructor with the serious courtesy of his father, and sitting on the porch in the evenings with Lewis and Stella talking about everything and nothing in the deep summer nights. When she left to go back to Columbus, she cried at the stagecoach in a way that was uncharacteristic of her, and she held Stella's hands for a long time before she boarded. "I will come back," she said. "I know," Stella said. "You were right to come," Catherine said, and this was the thing she had needed to say and that Stella had needed to hear, the closing of the last piece of unfinished business between them. She did come back, the following spring, and this time she filed her own homestead claim on 40 acres that had come available north of Redemption Flats near the old Whitfield property, and she began teaching at the new school in town, and she built her life in the territory the way women who were determined and brave built things, one solid piece at a time. The 90s came on in Redemption Flats the way decades do, carrying new things and changing old ones, and leaving the essential character of the place, which was independence and hard work, and the particular freedom of a country where the land was still larger than the ambitions of the people on it, essentially unaltered. Lewis expanded the Box W to include a breeding operation, improving his herd line with a bull he bought at considerable expense from a rancher in Colorado, and the quality of the Box W cattle became a recognized commodity in the regional markets. The ranch was prosperous in a solid and unshowy way that suited its owner entirely. Stella's East Field had, by the early 90s, evolved into a genuine grain operation, small by the standards of the big Kansas and Texas farms but substantial for the territory, producing wheat and barley that she sold in Redemption Flats, and to a flour mill that had established itself in the next town east. The income from the field was hers, managed by her, recorded in the account book she kept in the adobe desk that Lewis had made for her from cedar planks as a wedding anniversary gift in 1885, and that she had kept in perfect order ever since. Samuel, at 10 years old, was a fixture on the cattle range, working alongside his father and the hands they hired each year with a combination of competence and delight that made the work look like play and the play look like work. Clara, at 8, was her mother's daughter in ways that were sometimes pointed out in Redemption Flats by people who meant it as a compliment and occasionally as a warning, and she took the comparison in both the spirit intended and the spirit she preferred, which were not always the same. Robert, the youngest, was a quiet and watching child who would turn out, in the fullness of time, to have a gift for drawing that no one in the family had predicted, and that produced, over the years, a series of records of the landscape and the life of the territory that were of the highest documentary value and eventually of considerable artistic interest. But that in 1890, one expressed itself mainly as an inability to come in for supper, because he was outside with a piece of charcoal trying to get the light on the mountains right. On a September evening in 1891, the exact anniversary of Samuel's birth and the 10th year since Stella had arrived in the territory, she and Lewis sat on the porch in the cool of the evening while the children were inside, and the mountains went through their evening performance of light and color, and she thought, deliberately and with great attention, about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Flats in the spring of 1881 with a battered trunk and $4.30 and the absolute intention of disappearing. That woman was not gone. This was important, and it had taken her time to understand it. She had not disappeared, which was what she had intended. She had instead arrived, which was different and better and the thing she had actually needed without knowing it. The land had not let her disappear into it, which it had been requested to do. The land had done what land always does, which is insist on being genuinely inhabited, genuinely worked, genuinely known. You could not vanish into land that was paying this much attention to you. You could only grow into it. And the man who worked this land beside her and had been working it for nearly 20 years now, whose hands she knew the way she knew the contours of her own property, whose silences she could read the way she read the weather, whose steadiness was the thing she had built against and leaned on in equal measure and had never found wanting. She looked over at him where he sat, 43 years old and weathered and entirely himself, watching the light change on the mountains with the complete attention he gave to all things that were worth attending to. "Lewis," she said. "Yes," he said, turning to look at her. "I am glad I did not disappear," she said. He looked at her for a moment with everything he was, which was a great deal, and then he said, "So am I," and took her hand on the armrest between them, and they sat together in the deep blue evening of the territory, with the mountains going dark and the first stars appearing above them, and the sound of their children inside the house, and the cattle somewhere on the range and the creek running in the distance, and all of it, every acre and animal and child and star, felt like theirs in the way that only real things that have been genuinely worked and genuinely loved can feel yours. She had come to the territory to disappear into the land. The land had other plans. So had the man who worked it. And the life they had made together on this specific, demanding, extraordinary piece of the earth was more than she had known to want when she had stood on that stagecoach platform in Columbus with her trunk and her small, ruined self and her secret and terrified hope that somewhere out there was a place that did not care about her past and was large enough to hold her future. It was here. It had always been waiting here, under this enormous sky, beside this man, in this red dust and cedar air and October light, and she had been brave enough to come and stubborn enough to stay, and the staying had become the whole of everything she was and would be. Lewis squeezed her hand. The stars came out in their numbers over the territory. The mountains held their ancient and indifferent and somehow entirely personal watch over the dark below. And Stella Wells, who had been Stella Langley, who had left Ohio with a battered trunk and the intention of vanishing, sat on her porch with her husband and felt, with the complete and unassailable certainty of something that has been built from the ground up and tested by weather and time and proven sound, that she was exactly, precisely, and finally where she belonged. In the years that followed, the story of the Wells family became in its small way a part of the story of the territory. Samuel grew into the rancher his father had been at his age, taking over increasing portions of the Box W's management through his late teens, with a capability that Lewis acknowledged with the same honest plainness he brought to everything, saying one morning over breakfast, "You run it better than I did at your age," and meaning it, and Samuel receiving this with the same quiet gravity that was entirely his father's and said, simply, "You built it well enough to run." Clara, true to everything her childhood had suggested, went to the normal school in Albuquerque at 17 and came back at 20 with a teaching certificate and opinions about the territorial curriculum that she proceeded to implement in the Redemption Flats school with an energy that was at once her mother's stubbornness and something entirely her own. She married at 23, a schoolteacher from Arizona named Thomas Farrell, who had the intelligence to recognize immediately what he was dealing with, and the wisdom to find it entirely attractive rather than daunting. And they set up a household in Redemption Flats where their arguments about educational philosophy were apparently the most interesting entertainment the town had to offer on any given evening. Robert's drawings eventually made their way to Santa Fe, where a small gallery had established itself serving the growing number of artists and intellectuals who were discovering the territory's extraordinary visual landscape. He was 22 when his first work was shown, and the reception was enough to confirm what everyone in the family had understood for years, that he had inherited neither the ranching aptitude of his father nor the agricultural determination of his mother, but some third thing entirely, a gift for rendering the world as it was and as it felt simultaneously. The mountains and the desert, and the people on them given back in charcoal and eventually in oils with a fidelity and a depth that made people stop and look. Lewis and Stella went to Santa Fe for Robert's first showing, their first time away from the ranch together in years, and they walked through the small gallery on a September evening with their son's vision of their world on the walls around them. The Box W at sunrise, the east field in wheat, the rocky formation where Lewis had pulled her out of the hailstorm on that August afternoon in 1881, rendered in charcoal with such exactness that Stella felt the cold rain on her face looking at it. There was a portrait of Lewis, full face, looking directly out of the frame with that characteristic steadiness that made her stop entirely in front of it and stand for a long time. "He got you," she said. "He got the hat," Lewis said, and the hat in the portrait was indeed rendered with particular affection, the battered thing that had been with him since before she had known him and was now such an established fixture that it had become almost abstract, a feature of Lewis Wells the way the mountains were a feature of the territory. She laughed, and he smiled, and they stood in the gallery in Santa Fe with their son's vision of their life around them. And the light through the gallery windows was the same October gold it always was in the territory, and she took his arm and leaned against him and felt the years of it, not as weight but as depth, the way good land deepens with time and work and becomes more itself with every season. They drove back to the Box W in a proper buggy now, the road between Santa Fe and Redemption Flats having been significantly improved over the years, and they arrived home as the moon was rising, the ranch house lit against the dark with lamplight from the kitchen where Dolly had kept supper for them, and the mountains were silver and black behind the property in the moonlight, and the cattle were quiet on the range, and the east field was cut and stubbled for the season. And the apple trees from Stella's planting in 1882 were mature and producing abundantly every fall, and everything that she had built and they had built together was present and solid and real in the dark around her. And she, stood in the yard of the Box W after Lewis had seen to the horses and looked at all of it with the particular love of a person who has made something genuinely theirs. He came and stood beside her and they looked at it together. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. He put his arm around her in the cool night air and she leaned into his side. And they stood together for a while longer in the yard of the ranch that she had helped him make into what it was, and he had helped her become what she was. The mountains keeping their ancient watch above them, and the stars doing their extravagant work in the New Mexico sky. And the story of what had happened here. The woman who had come to the territory to disappear and found instead that the land would not let her. That the man who worked it had no intention of letting her vanish. That the life that waited on this specific stretch of desert and grass and rock was more than she had thought to ask for, and everything she had needed was complete in the way only true things are complete, whole and certain and without any thread left loose, every acre deeded and settled, every season lived and accounted for, every piece of love that had been given returned in full measure and planted in the ground between them where it had grown. The way things grow in this country when the conditions are right, quietly and stubbornly, and without any fanfare at all, into something that would last.